My name is Evelyn Brooks, and today I'm going to tell you about Margaret Holloway. She was 32 years old in the summer of 1973, living in a small town called Ashford, just outside Pittsburgh. Margaret worked at the town library, and every morning she walked the same route, past the bakery, across Main Street, under the oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. But what you need to understand about Margaret is this. She could hear things other people couldn't. Not voices in her head. Nothing like that. She could hear the truth in people's words, the weight of what they weren't saying. It was like being able to see through walls, except with sound. She never told anyone about this. How could she? They'd think she was crazy. On June 14th, a Thursday, Margaret opened the library at 9 in the morning like always. Mrs. Peterson came in first, returning 3 romance novels. Mr. Chen brought his son to check out books about dinosaurs. Everything was ordinary, until Deputy Richard Moss walked through the door at 10:30. Richard was 45, married, father of 2. He'd been a deputy for 12 years, and everyone in town trusted him. He came to the library every Thursday to read the newspapers from other cities, said it helped him stay informed. That morning, when Richard said good morning to Margaret, she heard something underneath his words. A tremor. A darkness. It was like hearing a crack in ice before it breaks. She watched him sit down at his usual table. He opened the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, but his hands were shaking. Just slightly. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Margaret went about her work, but she couldn't stop watching him. Something was very wrong. At 11, the phone rang. Margaret answered. It was Sheriff Coleman, Richard's boss. Margaret, is Deputy Moss there? Yes, he's reading the papers. Don't let him leave. I'm on my way. The line went dead. Margaret's heart began to pound. She looked at Richard. He was staring at the newspaper, but she could tell he wasn't reading. He was listening. He'd heard her end of the conversation. For 3 minutes, neither of them moved. The library was empty, except for the 2 of them. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, a car drove past. Then Richard stood up. He walked slowly toward the front desk, where Margaret stood. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. You heard that, didn't you? Richard said quietly. Margaret nodded. I need you to understand something. His voice was steady now, but underneath it, she heard something breaking apart. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Any of what? Richard looked at the door, then back at her. 3 weeks ago, I pulled over a car on Route 22, just a routine traffic stop. The driver was a young man, maybe 25. He was nervous, sweating. I asked him to step out of the vehicle. Margaret gripped the edge of the desk. When I searched the car, I found $50,000 in cash in the trunk. No drugs, no weapons, just money. He told me he was taking it to his sister in Ohio, that their mother was sick and needed surgery. He begged me not to arrest him, said the money was everything they had. What did you do? I let him go, but I kept the money. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt sick. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong the second I did it. But we've been drowning in debt, Margaret. My daughter needs braces. My son needs college. My wife's been working 2 jobs just so we can keep the house. I told myself I'd pay it back somehow. I told myself it was just this once, but Margaret could hear what he wasn't saying. This wasn't the first time. Yesterday, the young man's mother died, Richard continued. She died because they couldn't afford the surgery. And this morning, his sister called the sheriff's office. She told them everything. About the traffic stop, about the money, about me. Margaret heard sirens in the distance. I could run, Richard said. I could walk out that door right now and disappear. But where would I go? What kind of man would I be? The sirens were getting closer. I have a daughter who thinks I'm a hero, Richard said, and his voice finally broke. How do I tell her what I've become? Margaret didn't have an answer. She just stood there, watching this man who'd lived in her town for 12 years, who'd helped her carry heavy boxes, who'd read to children during library story time, fall apart in front of her. The sheriff's car pulled up outside. Through the window, Margaret could see Sheriff Coleman getting out, his face grim. Richard took a deep breath. He straightened his shoulders. For just a moment, he looked like the deputy everyone thought he was. "Thank you for listening, Margaret," he said. Then he walked to the door and opened it. What happened next happened fast. Richard stepped outside with his hands raised. Sheriff Coleman approached him, another deputy right behind. They spoke words Margaret couldn't hear through the glass. Richard nodded. He turned around and let them put handcuffs on him. But just before they led him to the patrol car, Richard looked back at the library. His eyes found Margaret through the window. She saw him mouth 2 words. "I'm sorry." Then he was gone. Margaret stood at her desk for a long time after they left. The library was completely silent. She thought about Richard's daughter, who would come home from school that day and learn that her father was a thief. She thought about the young man whose mother had died. She thought about how one choice can destroy everything. That evening, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept seeing Richard's face, hearing the crack in his voice when he talked about his daughter. She thought about the $50,000 and the woman who died without it. She thought about Richard's wife, who'd worked 2 jobs and still didn't know her husband was a criminal. She thought about the other families Richard had stolen from, the ones Margaret didn't even know about yet. But mostly, she thought about those 3 minutes in the library when she and Richard had just stood there, waiting for the inevitable. She kept asking herself, should she have said something? Should she have tried to stop him? Should she have told him to run? 3 months later, Margaret went to Richard's trial. She sat in the back of the courtroom and listened to everything. The prosecutor said Richard had stolen money from 7 different people over the past 2 years, $73,000 total. Some of it he'd used for his family. Some of it he'd gambled away, trying to win enough to pay back what he'd taken. The young man whose mother died gave a statement. His name was David Torres. He was 26 years old and worked as a mechanic. He stood at the podium and talked about his mother, Maria, who'd raised him and his sister alone after their father died. He talked about how she'd started getting sick 2 years ago, how the doctor said she needed surgery, but their insurance wouldn't cover it. He talked about how he'd worked 3 jobs, saved every penny, and finally got enough money together. "I was driving through the night," David said, his voice shaking. "I was so close. Just 3 more hours and I would have been at the hospital. I would have handed that money to the doctors, and they would have saved her. But Deputy Moss took it. He looked me in the eye, listened to me beg, and he took it anyway." David paused. He was crying now, and he didn't try to hide it. "My mother died 6 weeks later. She died in pain, asking me why I couldn't save her. And I had to tell her that I'd had the money, that I'd gotten it to her, but someone took it, someone she would have trusted, someone who was supposed to protect people like us." Margaret watched Richard as David spoke. Richard kept his head down, his hands clasped in front of him. His shoulders shook. He was crying too. But that wasn't all. There were 6 other victims. An elderly couple who'd been saving for their granddaughter's wedding. A single mother who'd scraped together bail money for her son, who'd been wrongly arrested. A veteran who'd been carrying his disability payment in cash because he didn't trust banks. A college student who'd sold his car to pay for his final semester of tuition. Richard had taken from all of them. He'd pulled them over, found the money, and kept it. And each time, he'd told himself it was the last time. Each time, he'd promised himself he'd pay it back. Each time, the guilt ate at him a little more, until he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at himself in the mirror. His lawyer tried to argue that Richard had been under extreme financial pressure, that he'd made terrible mistakes, but wasn't a violent criminal, that he deserved a chance at rehabilitation. The prosecutor argued that Richard had betrayed public trust in the worst possible way, that he'd used his badge to prey on vulnerable people, that he deserved the maximum sentence. The judge listened to everything. Then she asked Richard if he had anything to say. Richard stood up. He looked at each of the victims, one by one. Then he spoke. "I don't have an excuse for what I did. I don't have words that can make this right. I took money from people who needed it more than I did. I told myself I was a good person having a bad time. But that's a lie. A good person doesn't steal from a man trying to save his mother's life. A good person doesn't take money from people who trusted him to help them. He paused, took a breath. I was a coward. I was drowning, and instead of asking for help, I dragged other people down with me. And the worst part is, I knew what I was doing. Every single time I knew. But I did it anyway because it was easier than facing the truth about who I'd become. Richard's voice broke, but he kept going. I know I'm going to prison. I know I deserve it. But I want everyone in this room to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this right. I will pay back every cent I took, even if it takes me 40 years. I will carry this guilt every day, and I will never, ever forget the people I hurt. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Margaret left the courtroom that day feeling hollow. She went home and sat in her living room in the dark, thinking about justice and redemption, and whether they were the same thing. But here's what Margaret told me when she called my radio show 5 years later. She said that on the day Richard was sentenced, after everyone had left the courtroom, she went to speak to him. They let her have 5 minutes before they took him away. She asked him one question. Why did you come to the library that morning? You knew the sheriff was looking for you. You could have run. And Richard told her this. He said, because I needed someone to know that I wasn't always this person. I needed someone to hear me say I was sorry before it was too late, and you were the only one I could trust to really listen. Margaret said that was the moment she understood something about human nature that she'd never grasped before. People don't just want to be heard. They want to be understood, even when they've done terrible things, especially then. She asked him one more question before they took him away. Do you think you can ever come back from this? Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I don't know, but I have to try, because if I don't, then Maria Torres died for nothing. If I don't become a better person, then all of this pain, all of this damage, it's just waste. And I can't live with that. Richard served 6 years of his sentence. When he got out in 1981, he moved to a small town in West Virginia. His wife had divorced him while he was in prison. His children wouldn't speak to him. His son was 19, and his daughter was 16, and both of them had told him they never wanted to see him again. He got a job at a warehouse loading trucks. He lived in a one-room apartment above a hardware store. And every month, without fail, he sent money to the families he'd stolen from. It wasn't much at first, $50 here, $100 there. But he never missed a payment. He kept a notebook where he tracked every cent he owed and every cent he'd paid back. He calculated that at his current rate, it would take him 32 years to repay everything he'd stolen, plus interest. He decided that was exactly what he would do. Years passed. Richard worked, paid his rent, sent his money to the families, and lived a quiet life. He didn't make friends. He didn't date. He didn't do anything except work and try to repay his debt. But something strange started happening around year 3. He started getting letters. The first one came from the elderly couple he'd stolen from. They wrote to tell him they didn't want his money anymore. They said they'd forgiven him, that they were old and didn't need it, and that they wanted him to use it to rebuild his life. Richard wrote back and thanked them, but he kept sending the money anyway. The second letter came from the single mother whose son had been wrongly arrested. She wrote to say that her son had been fully exonerated and had gone to college on a scholarship. She said she was grateful for the money Richard was sending back, but she wanted him to know that. She prayed for him every night. She said she believed people could change, and she hoped he was finding peace. Richard kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. The letters kept coming. Not from everyone, but from enough people that Richard started to believe something he'd thought was impossible, that forgiveness might be real. But not everyone forgave him. David Torres never responded to any of Richard's letters. Richard sent him money every month for 30 years, and David never once acknowledged it. Richard didn't blame him. How could he? He'd killed David's mother, as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. In 1993, 12 years after Richard got out of prison, something happened that changed everything. Richard was walking home from work when he saw a man beating a woman in an alley. Without thinking, Richard ran over and pulled the man off her. The man turned on Richard, pulled a knife, and slashed him across the chest. Richard didn't stop. He tackled the man, held him down until the police arrived, and probably saved that woman's life. The knife wound required 47 stitches, and Richard nearly died from blood loss. The local newspaper ran a story about it. They called Richard a hero. They didn't know about his past, didn't know he was an ex-convict who'd spent 6 years in prison for theft. They just knew he'd saved someone's life. But someone who read that story did know who Richard was. David Torres. David was 38 years old by then. He'd gotten married, had 2 kids, worked as the manager of an auto repair shop. He'd built a good life despite everything. But he'd never forgotten what Richard Moss had done to him, and his mother. When David saw Richard's picture in the newspaper, something inside him snapped. He got in his car and drove 7 hours to West Virginia. He found Richard's address and showed up at his apartment late one night. Richard opened the door and saw David standing there. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then David said, "You saved that woman's life. I did what anyone would do." Richard replied. "No," David said. "Most people would have walked away. Most people don't risk their lives for strangers. But you did. Why?" Richard looked down at his hands. They were shaking. "Because I know what it's like to stand by and let something terrible happen. I know what it's like to choose wrong. I couldn't do that again." David stood there in the doorway. This man, whose life Richard had destroyed. And Richard could see him trying to decide something, trying to choose between hate and something else. Finally, David said, "My mother died thinking I'd failed her. She died believing I couldn't save her. And for 15 years, I've hated you for that. I've woken up every single day wishing you were dead." Richard nodded. He understood. "But then I saw that picture of you in the newspaper," David continued. "And I saw the interview where you said you didn't think of yourself as a hero, where you said you were just trying to do better than you'd done before. And I realized something." He paused. "You can't give me back my mother. You can't undo what you did. But you're trying to be better. And maybe that's all anyone can do." Richard started to cry. He couldn't help it. He'd been carrying this weight for so long, this unbearable guilt. And now here was the one person who had every right to hate him forever, offering him something he didn't deserve. "I don't forgive you," David said, and his voice was firm. "I can't, not yet, maybe not ever, but I don't want to hate you anymore. It's eating me alive, and I have kids now who need me to be better than that." Richard understood that too. They talked for 3 hours that night. David told Richard about his mother, about all the things Richard had never known about Maria Torres. She'd been a teacher before she got sick. She'd loved gardening. She'd made the best tamales in their neighborhood and gave them away to anyone who needed food. She'd been the kind of person who made the world better just by being in it. Richard listened to all of it. He let David's grief wash over him, let himself feel the full weight of what he'd taken from the world when he stole that money. Before David left, he told Richard one more thing. He said, "Keep sending the money. Keep trying to be better. Because if you don't, then my mother really did die for nothing. And I can't accept that." Then he drove home. Richard never saw David again. But every year on Maria Torres's birthday, he received a card from David. It never said much, just, "Still here, still trying. Hope you are too." And every year, Richard sent one back. Margaret never saw Richard again either after that day at the courthouse, but 15 years after that day in the library, she received a letter. It was from Richard's daughter, who was 28 years old by then. Her name was Sarah. The letter said that she'd finally forgiven her father, that she'd visited him for the first time since he went to prison, that they'd talked for hours, and he'd told her about everything, about the stealing, the guilt, the prison, the years of trying to pay everyone back, and he'd told her about the librarian who'd listened to him on the worst day of his life. Sarah wanted Margaret to know that her father had become a good man again. Not perfect, but good. He volunteered at a youth center, talking to kids about making mistakes and finding your way back. He'd been sober for 10 years. He'd never stopped trying to be better. And she wanted Margaret to know something else. She said that her father had told her that the 5 minutes he spent with Margaret in that library were the 5 minutes that saved his life, because she hadn't judged him. She'd just listened. And that small act of human kindness had given him the strength to keep going when everything else fell apart. Margaret kept that letter until the day she died. I think about this story all the time. I think about how we're all one choice away from being Richard Moss. How easy it is to convince yourself that wrong is right when you're desperate. How hard it is to come back from that edge once you've crossed it. But I also think about Margaret, about how she stood in that library and listened to a man confess his crimes, and instead of condemning him, she gave him something more powerful than judgment. She gave him witness. She let him be fully seen, fully human, in his worst moment. That's the thing about listening. Real listening. It doesn't excuse what someone's done. It doesn't make their choices right, but it does something else. It reminds them that they're still human, that they still matter, that their story isn't over yet. Margaret died in 2006. She was 65. I went to her funeral, and Richard Moss was there. He was 78 years old, thin and frail but still standing. He sat in the back, and when it was over, he put a single white rose on her casket. He didn't speak to anyone. He just stood there for a moment, his hand on the wood, and then he left. I found out later that he did that every year on the anniversary of the day he was arrested. He'd drive 7 hours to Ashford, put a flower on Margaret's grave, and drive home. He never missed a year. The last time I spoke to Richard was in 2019. He was 91 years old. His voice was weak, but his mind was sharp. I asked him why he still made that drive, why he still honored the memory of a woman who'd only spent 5 minutes with him. He said, "Because she taught me that redemption isn't about forgetting what you did. It's about remembering, and choosing to be different anyway. Every year, I go back to remind myself of that, to remind myself of who I was, and who I decided to become." I asked him if he thought he'd succeeded, if he thought he'd redeemed himself. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I paid back every cent I stole. Took me 29 years, but I did it. I've spent 40 years trying to be the person I should have been from the start. But do I think I've redeemed myself? I don't know. That's not for me to decide. All I can do is keep trying until I die." Richard Moss died last year. His daughter called to tell me. She said that in his will, he'd left instructions for one final thing. He wanted to be buried in Ashford, near Margaret Holloway's grave. He wanted the headstone to say just his name, his dates, and one sentence: he learned to listen. Sarah asked me if I thought her father had been a good man. I didn't know what to tell her, because the truth is complicated. Richard Moss did terrible things. He stole from people who desperately needed that money. He caused immeasurable pain. Maria Torres died because of him, and nothing he did for the rest of his life could bring her back. But he also spent 40 years trying to be better. He paid back every cent. He helped countless young people avoid the mistakes he'd made. He saved a woman's life. He became the kind of person who could look his own evil in the face and choose to walk away from it. So was he a good man? I don't know. But I know he tried. And maybe, in the end, that's all any of us can do. Here's what Richard's daughter told me, right before we hung up. She said that her father had inspired her to become a social worker, that she'd spent her career helping people who'd made terrible mistakes find their way back, that she'd saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds, by refusing to give up on people everyone else had written off. She works with ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives. She helps people struggling with addiction. She advocates for juvenile offenders who deserve a second chance. And she said that every time she wants to give up on someone, every time she thinks a person is beyond saving, she remembers her father. She remembers that he stole $73,000 and caused a woman's death, and still managed to become someone worth remembering. And it all started with 5 minutes in a library. That's the power of listening. That's the power of witnessing someone's worst moment and saying, through your presence, through your attention, you are still human. Your story is not over. You can still choose who you want to be. I never met Richard Moss, but I wish I had. I would have told him what Margaret told me, right before she died. She said, "Everyone deserves to be heard, Evelyn. Everyone. Because sometimes, being truly heard is the only thing that keeps us from disappearing entirely." This is Echoes of 1970. Thank you for listening.